He wrote an important book on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, Cosmopolitan Reflections. He did that with ISGAP-Oxford back in the day. I guess we are, we're colleagues, fellow warriors, and David has been really fighting on all fronts, intellectually, politically, I'd even say socially, because as we had a whole session on what happens when you engage these issues, and David has really been at the forefront for a long time now, fighting the fight, and he's, I dare say, getting traction in the academy, and I would even say within the Jewish community, within the human rights community, and in the policy area. His work has been at the forefront of leading a path for people to have a clear analysis of what the processes are taking place in UK internationally at this moment. So thank you for doing it.
Hi everybody, good morning. I wanted to do something a little bit clever, which was really just to go through my Facebook and Twitter feed for the last 2 weeks and talk it through with you, but I can't connect, so don't worry about it. What I will do is go through some other material, and I will ad lib as I go. I want people to interrupt me and to ask questions. We don't have very much time, so what I want to do is go through some of the material, some of the examples, some of the things that have been happening, and to relate that to some thinking and theory and sociology of anti-Semitism. So in terms of an academic study, we're looking at case study and we're relating it to concept, and we're looking at concept and relating it to case study, but also in terms of a kind of fight, a political fight over anti-Semitism and issues about democracy and populism more widely. We're looking at the same material and the same conceptualization in a slightly different language. At the end of my book, there's a chapter about methodology, or a little bit about methodology. And one of the things I say, which felt like one of the most controversial things I said in the book, was that Facebook is part of my method and Twitter is part of my method. What I do is I study discourse. I study the ways in which people think and argue and fight. What?
You're just shouting into my phone.
All right, I'll put that down. Yeah.
It's just going to be part of the... You should be lower? Lower.
Well, leave me alone. There you go. Maybe not. What are you going to do?
I'll put it on you.
Where are you going to put it on me?
That's, I don't know how to answer that question. How about you? There you go. Okay.
All right then. I don't know what I was saying. Or
Football.
Facebook and Twitter. So in a sense, right, what my scholarly work is about studying the ways in which people think and the ways in which people talk. I'm not an expert in the Middle East or the Israel-Palestine conflict or Israel. I don't speak Hebrew, I don't speak Arabic. But what I do know a little about is the way that people think about Israel and Palestine and Jews in Britain and in the wider world. So in a sense, Facebook and Twitter are kind of part of a participation in discourse. It's a kind of action research, a kind of participatory method. And in a sense, it's a first draft of what you're thinking and how you're thinking. Anyway, so all that to say, no more Facebook shaming. Facebook is perfectly respectable behaviour. This is Chantal Mouffe. People might know her. She's a very... Oh. All right, we're not in focus now.
Yeah, I'll give it.
Chantal Mouffe, people will know as a perfectly respectable social theorist. And Chantal Mouffe wrote this about the rise of the Jeremy Corbyn faction in the Labour Party. Of course, the fight to reshape Labour is not yet won, she says, about the fight to revolutionise it, in support of the Corbyn faction. And the internal struggle with the Blairites continues apace. Blairite being a kind of word for everything bad in the world. Well, it's a really interesting point, actually. People might know about the term third period Stalinism. People might remember, I remember really well being taught the slogan as a young socialist, socialism or barbarism. And the idea that bourgeois democracy was at an end, and this was from the 1930s. Democracy was finished. Weimar only proved the futility of bourgeois democracy, and everybody now agreed that this democratic state was obsolete, and it was a fight now between us, the good guys, and the fascists for who would take over, socialism or barbarism. And it seems to me that this enmeshed at that time with what was called third period Stalinism, that the left, large parts of the communist left, said that the real enemy, the big enemy, is social democracy. And the reason they said the big enemy is social democracy is because they said capitalism is just about to fall, and social democracy is the only force which can keep it going, and so social democracy is the big enemy. And what that did politically was to legitimize the fascist critique of democracy, and to say the fascists have basically got this right. The fascists have got the critique of the establishment and the elite right, but we need to offer a different solution. And it seems to me that in our time, what takes the place of social democracy as the formation which is symbolic of everything bad in the world, and the thing that both the left populists and the right populists agree on, is that Blair and Clinton and Obama are responsible for the current crisis, and the European Union and the democratic state and the establishment and the elites. So that's the framework within which Chantal Mouffe talks, I think. The internal struggle with the Blairites continues apace. Corbyn's opponents have tried various manoeuvres in order to discredit him. The most recent of which has consisted of accusing him of tolerating anti-Semitism within party ranks. So there's a question of anti-Semitism within the party ranks. It's not even a question that Corbyn himself is accused of being anti-Semitic. The accusation is that he's accused of tolerating anti-Semitism. And when Mouffe looks at this accusation, she says, this is a maneuver. And it's a maneuver intended to discredit him. In other words, she doesn't ask, if I say there's a problem that Corbyn tolerates anti-Semitism within the ranks of the Labour Party, she doesn't say, oh, that's interesting, I wonder if that's true. I wonder what the evidence for that is. I wonder what the argument is. I wonder what examples they're giving. I wonder what the politics of that is. She doesn't say any of that. What she says is, this is a maneuver in order to discredit Corbyn. And she ties the maneuver to the Blairites. And the Blairites in this context are the people who are outside of our political community, outside of the political community of the good. So the Blairites are mobilizing this accusation of anti-Semitism. Last week, we had one of the members of the Labour Party National Executive Committee was secretly recorded in an NEC meeting with the whole leadership of the Labour Party present, saying that the problem really comes from Jews who support Trump. Now, I can tell you that not one single Jewish member of the Labour Party supports Trump. None of us. Not one of us. Right? Maybe some Jews support Trump, but the political content of the accusation that those who raise the issue of anti-Semitism are Trumpists, are Blairites, are hostile to the Labour project. What this accusation does is put us outside the room. So it says, I'm not even going to listen to what you say. I'm not even going to listen to your talk about anti-Semitism. I'm going to say you're a Blairite, you're a Trumpist, and therefore you're somebody with whom we cannot have a rational discussion. You're not part of the community of discussion and comradeship and evidence. I saw a tweet from Tariq Ali. I mean, a really kind of a person with great respect yesterday, and the tweet said that the Jewish Leadership Council, the chair of the Jewish Leadership Council is Jonathan Goldstein, and Jonathan Goldstein is connected to Saatchi and Saatchi, and Saatchi, the advertising agency, is run by the chair of the Tory party. So by a kind of three-leap link, the people raising the issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party are Tories. Tories, Blairites, Trumpists, people outside of the community. So you understand that this makes rational discussion about anti-Semitism impossible, because what it does is it puts you out of the room. This is what I've called the Livingston formulation, and I'll come back to that later. This is from about 2 or 3 months ago. There was a debate in Parliament about anti-Semitism, and a whole number of especially Labour MPs spoke really, really well about their experience of anti-Semitism, of being accused of being Blairite and anti-party and anti-socialist. And many of them were women. Our really best MPs, Luciana Berger and Ruth Smeeth and Louise Ellman. And very often the kind of abuse they get is gendered, Zionist bitch, things like that. And they spoke, also Margaret Hodge, who's been in the news more recently, and they spoke about their experience of anti-Semitism within the party and their experience of anti-Semitism more widely. And Jeremy Corbyn puts out one of his statements to address it, and he says, "I pay tribute to MPs who spoke in yesterday's anti-Semitism debate, whose harrowing experience remind us of the urgent need to eradicate anti-Semitism from politics and society." So that's really great. Jeremy Corbyn's on our side. But the interesting thing, of course, the obvious thing, of course, is that they were talking about him. They were talking about him and the politics that he embraces and its relationship to the anti-Semitism that they experience. He says there's no excuse for abuse of any kind, and I want to thank them for their bravery in speaking out. They're talking about him. Let me explain one of the issues which I think is very simple and very important, and it's exemplified. People will know that Labour disavowed the IHRA definition. We know what that is. We've talked about that. Labour disavowed it, and they made their own kind of homemade version. And one of the things they put in their homemade version, and this is not a quote, but this is what they said, was that hostility to Israel can only be considered anti-Semitic if it is motivated by anti-Semitic intent. Now, the idea, given the sociology of racism and the practice of anti-racist activity, the idea that racism can only be racist if it's based on some kind of intent is a really kind of old-fashioned idea that we have dealt with decades ago. Racism is knowable in norms and practices and ways of thinking and unacknowledged discourses and structures of power. And we all accept that with racism, but with anti-Semitism it becomes a different issue. And the idea that there's a political anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and a way of thinking which is anti-Semitic and a licensing, a tolerating of anti-Semitism, that idea is the idea that Jeremy Corbyn can't handle. So what he does is he says, if there are any anti-Semites here in this room, we will chuck them out. As if anti-Semitism was an inner badness, a moral deficiency within an individual, right? And we saw all this in the 90s, actually, in Britain with the debates around racism in policing. And the police would say, yeah, there's racism in the police force, just like there's racism everywhere else. There's a bad apple in every barrel. We take the bad apple out, and the barrel's fine. And people said, hang on, there's a problem with the barrel. There's a problem of institutional racism, of ways of thinking, of norms and practices. And finally, in the debate about racism in the police, Macpherson held the public inquiry, and he said there is an issue of institutional racism in the police force, and we need to look at the barrel. Jeremy Corbyn refuses to look at the barrel. His inquiry, chaired by Shami Chakrabarti, did a few useful things about looking at bad apples, but it refused to look at the barrel. And what I mean by that is this. There are some incidents or individuals that everybody can recognize as anti-Semitic, right? If a councillor stands up and starts talking about people with big noses or about Israel being connected to the Hollywood media apparatus or the tropes that we're well aware of, right? Everyone can agree that those things are anti-Semitic. But why is it that these incidents have suddenly blossomed? Why is it that there are suddenly lots and lots of them? And of course, the Corbynite defenders say, well, there's only lots and lots of them because our enemies are publicising them. So it's a kind of fake news story, yes? There's only all these incidents going on. It's basically fake news. But in fact, what we have is a leader of the Labour Party who's heavily implicated in the politics of anti-Semitism. And what Chakrabarti and Corbyn refused to do was to look at the relationship between the discourse and the incidents. Let me talk a little bit more about that. All right, I'll come to some concrete examples in a minute because it's very important. Amy. So in the spring of 2017, the stories of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party were becoming quite important. It was at Prime Minister's Question Time, for example. It was well known that Jeremy Corbyn had referred to people from Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends. Actually, that wasn't the interesting bit, because he slithered out of that quite nicely, and he said, look, I'm for peace, I'm for discussion, these guys are in the room, and we are polite to them in a diplomatic way. But what he went on to say in the same speech was that he regards Hamas and Hezbollah as being parties which are dedicated to peace, dedicated to the good of the Palestinian people, dedicated to political and social justice throughout the region of the Middle East. So that's an example of his politics. If I said to you, I think the KKK is dedicated to the good of the American South, you wouldn't have much difficulty in understanding that as a statement of support for the KKK. But of course, in this case, it's impossible. Why? Because Jeremy is good and he's an anti-racist, and therefore you must have misunderstood. So I'm talking about the relationship then of that kind of politics with the incidents, the kind of bad people being mean, and the politics. I will come back to that. This slide is interesting. 2001 is a moment. I don't think it's the moment when any of this was created, but it's a symbolic moment. Durban, the global conference against racism in the new South Africa, the South Africa which was liberating itself from racism, a kind of moment of hope and excitement and a very symbolic moment. And there was a largely successful campaign at Durban. And it was a huge conference. It was a intergovernmental conference and also an NGO conference. And there was like 20,000 people in the cricket ground in Durban and on the seafront of activists against racism. And there was a successful campaign at Durban to construct the key racism on the planet after the defeat of apartheid as being Zionism. To put Zionism at the very center of the political universe of those who fight racism all over the world. So Durban was political. 9/11 was at the end of the same week. So many of the Jewish activists who had been at Durban and who had experienced a kind of onslaught of anti-Semitism which they weren't expecting couldn't get home because air traffic wasn't flying. And 9/11 is kind of symbolic of the re-emergence of a jihadi Islamist politics of a certain kind. And at the end of that year, 1 or 2 months later, or 3 months later, was what may turn out to have been the end of the peace process at Taba. So 2001 is a symbolic moment of politics, of the re-emergence of a new jihadi Islamist politics, and the end of the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the reassigning of blame. So the discourse from Israel and Palestine went from they are going to make peace in the end when they finish their horse trading and everything's going to be good, went from that to people reassigning the kind of primal cause for oppression in the Middle East onto one nation or the other. The theorists of a new anti-Semitism have argued that hostility to Israel may be anti-Semitic, and I've got 4 ways in which we can think about how that might work. In its motivation, I've kind of covered that a little bit in terms of intent. Sure, people like David Irving are anti-Semitic, and they adopt the rhetoric of being against the Israeli government because it suits their anti-Semitism. So that's certainly possible. But I think most of the anti-Semitism we see is not motivated by an underlying hatred of Jews. Most of the anti-Semitism we see is carried by people who rightly consider themselves to be opponents of anti-Semitism, right? You cannot understand Jeremy Corbyn if you cannot understand that he honestly believes himself to be an opponent of anti-Semitism, and I dare say a better opponent of anti-Semitism than any of us. So he's not motivated by Jew hatred. His anti-Semitism comes from somewhere else. So perhaps it's form. Perhaps people who repeat old anti-Semitic forms, blood libel, conspiracy, perhaps that's a way to understand what is anti-Semitic and what isn't. But then there's still, actually Jeremy Corbyn's quite good at usually avoiding conspiracy theory and blood libel, although not always. What I wanted to show you, one of the things on Facebook that I can't find, something that emerged yesterday in which, and it's from a few years ago, Corbyn is on TV, in fact on Press TV, which is the propaganda channel in English of the Iranian regime, and he's giving an interview on Press TV and he says the BBC is biased. Ha ha ha. He's on the propaganda channel of the Iranian regime, right? The BBC is biased. What's his evidence of bias? He says the BBC is biased in favour of the idea that Israel has the right to exist. Think it through. He also says the BBC is biased in favour of the idea that Israel has its security concerns. So, and in that little interview, you can see the idea that the Israeli embassy mentions, the Israeli embassy and the Israeli government are very powerful and are able to police the discourse of the BBC. So you can see a kind of conspiratorial politics underneath it, complete with a little dig at the Director General of the BBC, who was married at one time to a Jewish woman. So you can kind of look at subtext and you can see conspiratorial ways of thinking. Jeremy Corbyn also at one time called for an inquiry into the influence of the Israel lobby on the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, and the influence of the Israel lobby explains a lot of the terrible things that the Foreign Office does. So there is form, right? Jeremy Corbyn's politics does have anti-Semitic form sometimes, but it's sometimes quite difficult to interpret, and sometimes you can interpret it in different ways. And usually he avoids anti-Semitic form. So what about disproportionality, quantity, intensity? Let me give you a story. People know I'm a university teacher, so we have an introductory session for our students every year, and I'm sitting in a lecture hall full of our new first years, and everybody gets 5 minutes. The guy from the student union comes in, he gets 5 minutes to speak. He's in a bit of a hurry. He says, we run political campaigns. We run a campaign against fascism, we run a campaign against student fees, and we run a campaign against the occupation. And then he goes on to talk about sports clubs and discos and stuff. And I'm sitting there looking around this room thinking, how does everybody know which occupation he's talking about? Why do people not assume he's talking about the British occupation of Afghanistan or Iraq? This was a few years ago. And if they assume that it's the occupation that we all suspect it might be, why are people not puzzled about why it should be? And what was going on in that room at that moment was that people were being socialised into a politics of student union activism in which their attitude to the occupation was going to be the key signifier of who they were to become politically. And not only the attitude to the occupation, but the attitude in the end to BDS and then to anti-Semitism. So Israel and Palestine and anti-Semitism becomes much more than itself. It becomes a whole symbolic marker of identity. And that is a worry. It's a worry for a number of reasons. One of which, of course, is that Christian Europe has always, or very often, defined itself in opposition to the Jews. Christianity itself, when it was codified into a religion in the 4th century, was defined in opposition to the Jews. And the Jews, in not accepting Christ, didn't only screw themselves, but they screwed us all, right? The Jewish refusal to accept redemption was a harm to the universal, was a block between us and the good life. And one of my great fears is that Jeremy Corbyn will become Prime Minister, but one of my great fears is that he won't. And then a whole generation of people on the left will have learnt that the enemy of socialism is the Zionists. And the thing standing between us and a Corbyn government turned out to be Zionism. And so we're looking at the re-education of a whole layer of people on the left to understand Zionists, or in other words, the overwhelming majority of Jews, or in other words, those Jews who refuse to disavow Israel, as standing between us and redemption. This is an old, emotional way of thinking about the world. So proportionality and intensity is important in a symbolic sense. The Israel-Palestine conflict and anti-Semitism in particular, and then the Jews, become a kind of symbolic moment which explains everything else. And then the fourth thing here is effect. Something might not be anti-Semitic in motivation or in form or in disproportionate quantity or intensity, but it might be anti-Semitic in effect. I remember years ago, one of my old, at that time, one of my comrades, Sean McGamner, who was a Trotskyist, who was the only Trotskyist in the 80s, the only leading Trotskyist in the 80s who was not for the destruction of Israel. And I remember Sean saying that even if BDS could help the Palestinians, it would still be too risky, because the risk would be that it would create the possibility of the emotional foundation of an anti-Semitic movement. What is the effect of creating the kind of anger which makes people want to vote to prevent Israeli academics coming to our campuses, coming into this room in Oxford to speak? So, those are some different ideas and senses in which there can be a relationship between hostility to Israel and anti-Semitism. This is my book. The book really is a story of the mainstreaming of anti-Zionism and its associated anti-Semitism from the periphery of the labour movement and the periphery of the left into the centre, into the leadership. When I was a student in the 1980s, we fought these battles against those who said Zionism is racism and therefore Zionism should not be allowed to be part of the community of student politics because it's racist and it should be no platformed and these people should be thrown out. And I was on the sort of Trotskyist left, and we fought with other Trotskyists and we fought with the Stalinists, and it was all very peripheral. And in 2016, Malia Bouattia moved from that marginal position in the student movement into the presidency, became the president of the student union. And she was somebody who condemned the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians as, quote, strengthening the colonial project. She was against the peace process because she thought it miseducated people to believe that there was some kind of peaceful way to freedom for the Palestinians. She thought BDS miseducated people because it also let people think that there was some kind of peaceful way for the Palestinians, and she thought that really we should support what she called armed resistance. She also talked about mainstream Zionist-led media outlets, which in our terms, in this, 2 years later, we can clearly see the whole idea, the whole notion of fake news, the whole notion that if news organizations say things that we don't like, we just denounce it as fake. And we on the left have been doing this for years, to be honest, sometimes in a more sophisticated way and sometimes in a less sophisticated way. But the idea that the media is basically a kind of production of bourgeois ideology, which teaches us how to accept our own subordination. We've been teaching the idea that news is fake for a long time. And we've been doing it a little bit carefully, and suddenly the Trumpists come along and they say, hey, that's cool. Hey, we'll use that. And this is her version. Mainstream Zionist-led media outlets, so the media is Zionist. I would say that the story of Malia Bouattia should also give us a little hope, actually. Why? Because she became the president of NUS, of the National Union of Students, which organises 1.4 million students in Britain. But the next year she lost. And actually, a number of student unions chose to disaffiliate from NUS and to say we don't want to have anything to do with it. But the ones who chose not to disaffiliate, the ones who chose to engage, and the Union of Jewish Students built political alliances with people with whom they didn't agree on everything. And they defeated Malia Bouattia the next year. So we should remember, a lot of what I have to say is bad news. A lot of what I have to say is a story, really, of things walking away from us, step by step, kind of relentlessly. There's no crisis. This is not 1933. The fascists aren't coming to power, but things have been just moving away from us, step by step, for the last 15 years. And sometimes they don't. Right? Sometimes we can move them back a little, so that's good. This is Len McCluskey, not so good. He's the General Secretary of the most powerful trade union in Britain. Quote, "The row over anti-Semitism within the Labour Party is nothing more than a cynical attempt to challenge Corbyn's leadership." Right? So the row isn't about anti-Semitism. It isn't whether there's a tolerance of anti-Semitism or not, or whether there's a political anti-Semitism or not, or whether to say that Hamas and Hezbollah are dedicated to peace and justice is a problematic comment. That's not what it's about. The row is nothing more than a cynical attempt to challenge Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. It's been called, I've seen a number of places on social media in the last couple of weeks, people talking about the coup, the attempted coup against Jeremy Corbyn, and what they're referring to is the discussions about anti-Semitism. There have been a lot of things going on the last couple of weeks, one of which was the Labour disavowal of IRA. So Labour took out a number of things from IRA that it wanted to continue doing, like it wanted to say that it was... actually, part of what they do is... Have you ever seen this? You raise the issue of anti-Semitism and people plead guilty to a lesser charge. So you say to Ken Livingstone, what you said was anti-Semitic. And he says, look, I'm a vulgar man. I'm a rude man. I lose my temper sometimes. It gets heated sometimes. I'm sorry if I caused offence. So people plead guilty to a million lesser charges, but never to anti-Semitism. So one of the things they did was to take out the idea that denouncing Israel as Nazi is anti-Semitic. And they kind of softened it and plead guilty to a lesser charge, a number of other things. After that debate on IRA within the Labour Party, Margaret Hodge, one of the veteran Jewish MPs, lost her temper with Corbyn, and she went up to him and shouted at him, "You're a racist and an anti-Semite." And the Jewish Chronicle went to her and said, "Is it true? Is this what you said?" And they gave her the quote, and she said, "Yeah, those two bits are true, but I didn't swear." And then what happens, of course, is that the Labour Party started disciplinary proceedings against Margaret Hodge. And we see this again and again and again. Anti-Semitism always constructs itself as the victim of the Jews. Anti-Semitism always constructs itself as powerless in the face of the powerful Jews. So Corbyn became the victim, Hodge became the perpetrator, and Hodge was subjected to a disciplinary procedure. Hodge got good lawyers and caused a bit of trouble for the Labour Party, and the Labour Party wrote back to her in the end and said, "Look, if you apologise, we'll stop the disciplinary proceedings." And she said, "I will not apologise. You apologise." And then they put out a statement saying Margaret Hodge has apologised and we've stopped disciplinary proceedings. There was something I wanted to say. Yes, this reversal is a reversal we are seeing more and more. And I want to say this very clearly, that the current rise of anti-Semitism on the left is in some ways a prototype of, and is in some ways connected to, the rise of populism more widely in European and American politics. You could not have Jeremy Corbyn clinging to power in the Labour Party if the Tory party also wasn't in crisis. And the similarity that I wanted to point to was this, was the portrayal more and more of racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia as being, in some sense, the cry of the oppressed. So anti-Semitism is often, and we're familiar with this, anti-Semitism is thought of, is constructed as the cry of the oppressed. We also see this with racism and xenophobia. Racism and xenophobia is the cry of the oppressed in Brexit Britain, in Italy, in Holland, in Le Pen's French provinces, and in the Trump election. Xenophobia and racism is interpreted by the clever people as the cry of the oppressed, and anti-racism is interpreted by the clever people as a discourse of bourgeois power intended to keep the oppressed oppressed. So a really odd and unpleasant reversal whereby anti-racism becomes the cry of the oppressed and racism becomes the cry of the oppressed and anti-racism becomes the discourse of power. And then you have the creation of these new formations, something called the white working class, which represents the oppressed. Of course, the working class is not white. The working class is diverse in a number of different dimensions. And the discourse of power is said to be coming from the cosmopolitans and the elite and the establishment and the people who are mobile and who move around, and the globalists and the bankers and the neoliberals, all of which can become very close to conspiracy theory. If you look at Donald Trump's final day campaign video, it's called Argument for America. It is a dog whistle to anti-Semitic conspiracists, and it is a whole discourse which is that close to anti-Semitic conspiracy, but he doesn't talk about Jews. And everyone on the American right goes, "How dare you say this about Trump? He never mentions Jews." But we're used to that. We've seen it for 15, 20, 30 years on the British left. We've seen people constructing anti-Semitic politics who never mention Jews, who never blame the Jews, who never do proper conspiracy theory or blood libel, but they do it in political ways which are deniable. So all the kind of disavowals we see in America following the election of Trump, we have seen and we are familiar with on the British left. I can go into that in more detail if people want. So this is the quote that I've already mentioned. People will see the bottom line, an organisation that is dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people, bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region. He's talking about Hezbollah. He's talking about the people who have been acting as the kind of shock troops for the Assad regime in Syria for the last 5 years. This is Rad Salah. This is what Corbyn had to say about a Palestinian leader who mobilised the blood libel. Quote, "We have never allowed ourselves to knead the dough for the bread that breaks the fast in the holy month of Ramadan with children's blood. Whoever wants a more thorough explanation, let him ask what used to happen to some children in Europe whose blood was mixed in with the dough of the holy bread." And Corbyn said, Salah is far from a dangerous man, and when he's done with this little court case, I want him to come and have tea with me on the terrace of the House of Commons. It's worth giving you these stories because very often, so I was invited the other day onto the big TV show on BBC Two Newsnight to debate with a defender of Jeremy Corbyn, and in the end this is what Newsnight do, they get you all excited that you're going on telly and then they say, oh, we don't need you anymore. So I watched it on the TV and I was actually sitting there watching and I was pleased that I wasn't there because it looked unwinnable to me and I was trying to work out why. And what they did was they started with a film and they said, here are some Jews who say there's a problem of anti-Semitism. And the Jews are very angry and they say, oh, there's anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And then they go to socialists who say, no, there's no anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. What the Jews want to do is to prohibit criticism of Israel and to silence the voice of the Palestinians. And that's how they go into a debate about anti-Semitism. And I'm thinking this debate is unwinnable. And I didn't realise why until I thought it through. The way TV normally works is that you show what it is you're worried about. So in fact, in the same show, earlier on, they had Sean Spicer. People remember Sean Spicer was the spokesperson for Donald Trump. And they showed Sean Spicer the pictures of Trump's inauguration with much fewer people than were at Obama's inauguration. And they said, you lied about this, didn't you? And I thought, that's what they didn't do with the discussion about anti-Semitism. They didn't show examples of anti-Semitism and then confront the defender of Jeremy Corbyn by saying, this is anti-Semitic, isn't it? They didn't do that. What they did was they set up a debate between some people saying we shouldn't prohibit criticism of Israel and other people saying there's a problem of anti-Semitism. So it's kind of interesting. So this is why I think it's really important to give you examples of what we're talking about. We're not talking about criticism of Israel. Here's another, this is Rad Salah. Stephen Sizer, Church of England vicar, been doing conspiracy theory for years and years and was eventually silenced or told to shut up by his church after he shared on Facebook an article headed 9/11, Israel did it. And finally, people kind of realised, no, this is kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Corbyn had defended Sizer. Sizer is the victim of a smear by the Israel lobby. Sizer, with his anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, is the victim. Yes? And I've mentioned this already, this turning upside down, whereby anti-Semitism always portrays itself as the victim of the Jews. In fact, this is true about racism in general, isn't it? Racists always define themselves as victims of the people they construct as being of the wrong race. And by the way, I was really interested in what Katia had to say about race as a verb and race not as a noun, because if I look back again, I go a little bit in the final chapter of my book to talk about myself, which I don't often do, but racism constructs race. Race is constructed by racists. And I'm looking at the way that when I was in my early 30s, I was a sociologist. I was a kind of young, upcoming kind of sociologist in a really cool sociology department. I was really proud to be sitting around the table with all my colleagues. And something happened. I started writing a little bit about anti-Semitism and opposing the boycott of Israeli academics. And suddenly I got raced. Suddenly I got defined by the people around my table, not as a sociologist, but as a Zionist sociologist. right? Now, I could have a discussion with you all day long about whether or not I'm a Zionist, right? And I can certainly construct for myself a self-empowering identity in which I'm a Zionist. But if you lot sit around the table and you construct me as a Zionist, and if what you mean by that is racist, pro-apartheid, pro-imperialist, Nazi, and in a conspiracy against Jeremy Corbyn, then that is how I get raced. Anti-Zionism constructs Jews, actually. Or it takes Jews and it constructs them as Zionists. True, it allows them to disavow, but many anti-Semitisms in the past, and this is one way in which Hitler was kind of unusual because he didn't allow Jews to disavow. Spanish Inquisition allowed Jews to disavow, although it didn't really. It allowed Jews to convert to Christianity, but it still treated them like Jews. And they still watched to see if your fire was burning on Shabbat. And, for generations afterwards, the Jews who had disavowed were still Jews, conversos. So the disavowal thing is interesting. Jeremy Corbyn was paid $27,000 over 3 years by the Iranian regime to front its propaganda channel in English. That's enough. I can stop there. I don't need to tell you anything else. I need to tell you that one thing, and you will say he can do what he likes, but he shouldn't be leader of the Labour Party, and he shouldn't be Prime Minister of Britain. And you say this to people, and you say, this is incompatible with democratic politics. And they say, why are you stirring up all this dirt? They say, this was years ago. Or they say, it's not true. Or they say, well, the BBC's biased too. By the way, the inability to make a judgment as to the distinction between totalitarianism and democracy, the inability to make that distinction in our day and age, I think, is hugely, hugely menacing. You don't have to think democracy is perfect to make a distinction. How long have I got?
We end at 12:30, so I don't know, 5-10
All right,
minutes.
let me think of a...
It's up to you.
Let me just make one kind of biggish point and then we'll think. How is it possible for Corbyn to believe that Iran, Putin, Hamas, Hezbollah are in some sense progressive, dedicated to peace and justice around the world? How is that possible?
He read Judith Butler.
He read Judith Butler. How is it possible for Judith Butler to believe that? So let me explain. It's actually not that complicated. The reason Judith Butler and Jeremy Corbyn believe that is because they divide the world into two. And they say the world is divided between imperialism and anti-imperialism. And what they mean by imperialism are the democratic states, fundamentally of Europe and the United States. And what they mean by anti-imperialism is everybody who's against Europe and America. So Hamas and Hezbollah, as Judith Butler said, people said, how dare you say that Hamas and Hezbollah are part of the global left? And she said, oh, well, it doesn't mean we like them. She said, what it means is that they're against American imperialism. So we center ourselves, we center America and our battle with American imperialism, and we recruit everyone in the world who can be said to be on our side. So we split the world, and of course this splitting of the world was done by the Soviet Union. This splitting of the world literally is a KGB conspiracy. Yes, the politics of splitting the world between imperialism and anti-imperialism came from the Soviet Union. It was originally socialism against the imperialist countries which wanted to destroy socialism. We can go into that whole history and that whole story. So that's one thing, is that Hamas and Hezbollah are progressive because they're against imperialism. But you still need a further step. And the further step is, why does Israel get positioned and constructed and raced as being at the keystone of that global system of imperialism? Why Israel? And it's a really difficult, knotty question, because as a sociologist, I want to be able to explain anti-Semitism in terms which don't rely on explaining it in terms of previous anti-Semitisms. See what I mean? But I don't think you can explain the centering of Israel in that global good-bad distinction without reference to the history of anti-Semitism. And let me give you two quotes that exemplify this worldview. This is from John Molyneux, who was an important theorist of the Socialist Workers' Party, which was the most important far-left party. Quote, "An illiterate, conservative, superstitious, Muslim, Palestinian peasant who supports Hamas." Just breathe in and think about that whole nest of stereotype. Illiterate, conservative, superstitious, Muslim, Palestinian peasant who supports Hamas is more progressive than an educated, liberal, atheist Israeli who supports Zionism, even critically. Right? Wow. So what that means is that what you believe and what you do and what you say is less important than who you are in this objective global struggle between imperialism and anti-imperialism. It's a totalitarian worldview. It's a worldview which constructs you as essentially part of a power structure over which you have no control. So even if you're liberal, even if you're atheist, even if you're critical of Zionism, if you're a Zionist, if you're an Israeli, you're on the bad side. And of course, totalitarianism essentializes various ways of being on the bad side. You're a Jew, you're a kulak, you're a bourgeois, you're an intellectual, and it wipes you out. So the idea that your identity is given to you by objective circumstance is a very menacing one. This is Seamus Milne. Seamus was a columnist in The Guardian, is now Jeremy Corbyn's Steve Bannon. I was going to say Toby Ziegler actually. Quote, "Hamas and the support it attracts is only the current expression of a spirit of Palestinian national resistance to oppression and dispossession going back decades. Don't worry if Hamas is anti-Semitic. Don't worry if Hamas murders gay people. Don't worry if Hamas puts women behind face covering, because the truth about Hamas is that it's only the current manifestation of a timeless democratic spirit of Palestinian national resistance." So the spirit, the timeless entity, in a very mystical way, is democratic. If it happens to be manifested in an undemocratic party today, don't worry about that. Because I, Seamus Milne, in London, am here to translate for you. And when Hamas says, vote for us, we want to kill the Jews, vote for us, we believe that a peace with Israel is a violation of Islam, and people, some people do vote for that, not everybody, some people vote for that. Some people vote for that for whatever reason. And there's Seamus to translate, and he says people voted for Hamas because they are the timeless spirit of Palestinian resistance. They're the democratic spirit of Palestine. And again, we get this also, people vote for Brexit. Why? Because they don't like foreigners, they don't want foreigners coming here taking our jobs, and they don't want foreigners from Germany and France telling us what to do, and they want British sovereignty. And the clever people in London say, actually, this vote was a critique of neoliberalism. Actually, this vote was a vote for everything that I believe in. And actually, the Brexiters and the Trumpists are kind of right with their diagnosis of globalism and neoliberalism and the elite and the establishment and fake news. All of that is kind of right, but they're on the wrong side. So socialism or barbarism, forget about the democratic state, socialism or barbarism, fight it out with the fascists. I think I will stop there for the moment, and I'm very happy to... Oh, you see all the things you're missing. Just quickly, the Livingston formulation, which will be familiar with you already because I've shown you many examples of it. Ken Livingston, years and years ago, in 2006, For far too long, the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used against anyone who is critical of the policies of the Israeli government, as I have been. The accusation of anti-Semitism, two elements. One, it is used, right? The Livingston formulation doesn't accuse Jews of being hysterical or shrill or overexcitable or mistaken or paranoid. Sometimes we do get accused of all of those things. And by the way, there is a misogynist tradition, there is a misogynist anti-Semitic tradition of portraying Jewish men as being female and hysterical and shrill and all of that stuff. I'm a bit grumpy about this because I was called hysterical the other day on the radio by someone who used to be a friend of mine. The point being, the Livingston formulation doesn't accuse us of getting it wrong. It accuses us of knowing that we're wrong and saying it anyway. Why? In a conspiracy to silence the voice of the oppressed. In reality, of course, we get accused of both, of being hysterical, but also of being part of a conspiracy. So that's one element of it. Has been used, right? It's not something that we just do by mistake, but it's something that we use. And the other thing is that it conflates criticism of the policies of the Israeli government. It conflates everything into that. Blood libel, conspiracy, BDS, support for Hamas, for Hezbollah, for Press TV, for Raad Salah. Everything is conflated into I'm critical of the policies of the government of Israel. You call me anti-Semitic because I'm critical of the policies of the government of Israel. So the Livingston formulation is the standard response. It shuts you up and it puts you outside of the room and outside of the community of rational and comradely discourse. And by the way, anti-Semites are not treated like that. If I am a young comrade and I say something like, well, we all know that the Israelis are in charge of Hollywood, I won't be shut up and put out of the room. Kind of rightly so, really. I'll be told, no, you mustn't say that. It's anti-Semitic, but don't worry about it because this is what you can say. So slipping into anti-Semitism is less of a crime than challenging anti-Semitism. I am going to stop there because I want to have some time for people to wait. One more thing. This book by Robert Fine and Philip Spencer. Robert Fine was a great friend of mine, and I'm really completely gutted that he died recently. And he was my PhD supervisor. He wrote this book with Philip Spencer and Robert Fine, which is a book which goes back through the history of the left, and it looks at the debates within the left on anti-Semitism. And it looks at Marx and Adorno and Arendt and critical theory, and it resurrects the Marxist critiques of left anti-Semitism. And it does so by focusing on the Jewish question. The Jewish question was never a question about Jews. It was always a question about anti-Semitism. And what they've said, what they called the book Anti-Semitism and the Left, on the return of the Jewish question. The return is the David Irving question. What is it that the Jews do to make everybody hate them? What is it that Israel does which brings anti-Semitism down on all our heads? And that's the Jewish question. And it should never be a Jewish question. It should always be a question about anti-Semitism. And if somebody asks me about Jewish anti-Zionism, I'll talk about that in a minute as well.
David, thank you very much. A lot of questions. Okay. I'm going to start off with a quick question. I've been speaking to people since I got here about Corbyn, and there's concern, and I was interested in your observation, and I think it's an insightful observation, how the potential defeat of Corbyn could cause another kind of wave of anti-Semitism because the Zionists or the Jews are going to be perceived as blocking socialism or the society from getting redemption, which draws on the old anti-Semitic and Christian tropes of anti-Semitism, that the Jews somehow stop the coming about of redemption. So my question is this: given your observation, given Corbyn's connection to Iranian television, now the Trump administration is snapping back sanctions against Iran. The European Union is yesterday calling, the head of the European Union is calling for the European Union to confront Trump and to maintain trade and to encourage trade with Iran. How does this put Jews and the labor movement, where does this put the Jewish community? On the one hand, we don't want to be portrayed by the socialists and the Corbyns as Trump supporters and conservative and blocking the socialist redemption. And now we're in a moment where Trump is pushing this sort of genocidal, inciting genocidal, anti-Semitic, reactionary, homophobic, anti-minority, sexist regime. Trump is putting pressure on it. Now the EU and progressive forces are saying, no, we have to maintain an agreement. Where does this put the fight against anti-Semitism in Europe? It seems to me it could be potentially a dangerous curry. All the ingredients for a nice curry are on the table. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, I'm not an international relations scholar or expert. I don't know what the best strategy to deal with Iran is. I mean, I saw.
Where does it put progressive people in the United Kingdom fighting anti-Semitism, fighting Corbyn, when Trump, the incarnation of right-wing America, is sort of now, you're kind of on the same side as Trump. Where does this put you?
Me?
And your colleagues, you and your...
Yeah, I mean, I can talk more clearly about the whole business about Jerusalem and the capital, really, because it was astonishing to me that anybody thought that Jerusalem wasn't the capital of Israel. Everybody knows that, everyone who's ever been to Israel knows where the capital of Israel is. And the idea that we then have a big kind of political fight over where the capital of Israel is. And somebody, there were people in the British media kind of demanding that Tel Aviv should be recognized as the capital of Israel. Just kind of complete sort of ignorance. And of course, what Corbyn said was right, that Israel was the capital of Israel, and actually went out of his way to say this doesn't mean there can't be a peace agreement, doesn't mean that the Palestinians can't also have a capital in Jerusalem, all of that stuff. And there was a kind of... What?
Who said that?
I think Trump said that.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, I think the fundamental thing about Trump is that he represents a big critique of democratic politics, of the idea that we are all fundamentally, there is something fundamentally equal about human beings, of the idea, and a whole load of really straightforward principles of democratic politics: equality, women's equality, LGBTQ equality, the rights over our own bodies, the basic arguments about free trade, the basic arguments about xenophobia and about racism. And I think Trump represents a challenge to that. And I think we see the same challenge coming from a number of parties and political forces all over Europe, and from the jihadis, and from the left intellectuals, and from Corbyn. As I say, I don't want to get into the discussion about Iran because I don't know. I saw what Jeff Hirsh wrote. I thought it was really interesting. I think there are reasonable arguments to be had about how to deal with the Iranian regime. How that affects us, of course, what can you do other than analyse what you think to be true? And if Trump happens to be saying it once or twice, that's not your fault. But you have to do it. And there's a passage in my book, actually, that reminds me of a passage in my book where, God, and I can't remember his name now, somebody was saying, look, if I say that there happens to be a conspiracy of the Israelis against the Palestinians, and they happen to be powerful around the world. And so, there happened that in this case, what the anti-Semites say happened to be right, and I say it, then I don't take any responsibility for that. And I don't agree with that. I think that we have to be responsible for our political discourse. And if we want to be critical of the Israeli government, which I certainly do, we have to do so in a way which doesn't excite anti-Semites and which doesn't help anti-Semites. So, similarly, if we want to talk about Iran, it might be that the ramping up of sanctions is a missed opportunity of going to the aid of the anti-regime forces within Iran. So I think those things are complicated, but I think that's what I have to say on that.
David, please do talk about Jewish Zionism.
I knew you'd say that.
Yeah, of course you are. I was going to say, but could you also, if it's not too much, do so with some attention to the gender dimensions of that?
To the what?
Gendered dimensions of that.
Okay. Are we doing one at a time?
Yeah, for now. Yeah.
Hang on. I have a slide. Oh! Well, it's all to do with kittens. Just turn that off and I'll talk. Jewish anti-Zionism is very important. And I'm trying desperately to think about the gender dimensions, and I'm not sure that I can think of anything too clever to say on that off the top of my head. Our experience within the trade union, within the university and college union in fighting the boycott was that Jewish anti-Zionism was very important. The Jewish anti-Zionists were not the kind of useful idiots of some other anti-Semitic force, but they were the leaders of the BDS movement. They would stand up before any debate and they would educate non-Jews to understand that they could vote for BDS without being anti-Semitic, and they should understand that the people saying they were anti-Semitic were really oppressors and Zionists and racists, and that they should have the courage to stand up against that. I always think that if I was not Jewish and if I was miseducated by Jewish anti-Zionists into an anti-Semitic worldview, boy, would I be angry about that. Would I be angry if I was kind of miseducated into pushing anti-Semitic politics by Jewish people as a Jew? I think it comes from... I think it's quite easy to see where Jewish anti-Zionism comes from. It's quite easy to understand that many, many Jews have a particular interest in Israel and a particular connection to Israel. And it's then easy to understand why many Jews have a particular anger with what Israel does wrong. You know, I do. I'm more cross with Netanyahu than I am with the people who rule Congo, who do, you know, bad things of which I'm only vaguely aware, right? So as a Jewish person, I'm kind of more interested in what Israel does and what it does wrong and what it does kind of in my name. And I can understand all that. So sometimes Jewish anti-Zionism gets kind of obsessive about its own Jewish identity and its own anger with its own country. And that's fine. I don't even mind that, right? What I really mind is when those people try to export the specifically Jewish hostility and obsession with the crimes of Israel into non-Jewish political and civil spaces. So when I take my Jewish obsession with the crimes of Israel and insist that my trade union adopts a Jewish obsession with the crimes of Israel, then we have a problem. I wrote in the book somewhere about the Israeli peace movement. And, you know, people who spend their every political moment sort of fighting the government and basically, you know, right to do so and right to be fighting for peace. And sometimes, and then they kind of felt betrayed. They kind of felt betrayed because they couldn't understand that the collapse of the peace process wasn't only the fault of Netanyahu, but there were also other things going on. But they had this fury with what they themselves had done wrong. And they remembered the old Bolshevik slogan. The old Bolshevik slogan was, the main enemy is at home. And they said, the main enemy is at home, meaning the enemy that we can attack, that we can criticize, is our own government. And they took the main enemy is at home into the global left, and they said to Judith Butler and to the University and College Union, you know what, the main enemy is at home, the main enemy. And they said, yeah, that's nice. We like that. You're right. The main enemy is Israel. And again, it's a transformation of the main enemy is our own government to the main enemy is your government, and the main enemy is the Zionist. You see what I mean, people? So I think those kinds of slippages from a kind of Jewish interest and a Jewish obsession and fighting for that, and then constructing... See, this again is a very old trope in the history of anti-Semitism, is that there were often Jews willing to kind of give evidence against the Jewish community. And what we have right now, to an astonishing level, is a huge consensus within the Jewish community in Britain, like you don't have in America at the moment, I think, but in Britain, a huge consensus within the Jewish community that there's a problem with the Labour Party, that the Labour Party should adopt the IHRA definition, that we see Jeremy Corbyn and his faction as being hostile. The consensus goes, there was a letter of 70 rabbis. Can you imagine 70 rabbis agreeing with each other from Masorti, from Liberal, Reform, United, from the Jewish Leadership Council, the Union of Jewish Students, the Board of Deputies. Everybody agrees. And they say there's a problem with the Labour Party that needs fixing. And then a tiny minority of anti-Zionist Jews come along and give evidence against the Jewish community and say the Jewish community actually wants to silence the voice of the oppressed and the voice of Jeremy Corbyn, and the Jewish community is actually involved in a kind of conspiracy. And it sounds plausible and it's very dangerous. And, one can understand that when one faces anti-Semitism, one doesn't always deal with it in a productive way. And, we know that about racism, we know that about anti-Semitism, is that just being somebody who experiences it doesn't make you somebody who has a kind of conscious and serious understanding of it.
Yeah, your talk, by the way, thank you very much, really interesting.
Thank you.
It occurs to me, as you were speaking, something that I've long believed, but I have a much greater sense of the urgency of it, that there is a real role to play for non-Jews in the fight against contemporary anti-Semitism, that there's a specific and really compelling reason for non-Jews to enter this fight that shouldn't have to be, but nonetheless there's a way that voice can be heard. Can you speak more about that?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I think we do have some of the most amazing allies, some of the most amazing voices who understand it, who are writing articles. We do have allies, but we don't have any kind of a solidarity movement. We don't have, interestingly, the only place where I have seen such a movement is in Germany. So I've spoken a lot about my book. I've been to about 10 cities in Germany. And in every university in Germany, there is a group of proper, serious, political people who want to fight anti-Semitism. They usually construct their political identity as being Israel solidarity, a term you would never hear in England, I suspect in the English-speaking world, outside of Jewish self-defense. So for kind of obvious reasons, this does exist in Germany. Doesn't really exist anywhere else that I've seen. And I think it's a real problem. I think we need a Jewish solidarity movement. And we don't have it. We have Jewish self-defense and Jewish anger and Jews raising the issue and Jews being denounced as simply trying to silence opponents of Israel in a tribal way. So I think I'm trying to say something a bit subtle. We do have some fantastic individuals who really get it. But we don't have any chance of really a political coalition. The other thing we get, of course, is we get help from the right. And what we see more and more is that people on the populist right are constructing their identity around anti-Semitism and their identity around the Israel-Palestine conflict and their identity as being pro-Israel, by which they normally mean pro-Netanyahu and pro-settlement. And you have people on the left constructing their identity around the Jews, around anti-Semitism, around Israel, around the Palestinians. And what you get is a kind of competition. The left will say, why are you talking about the anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn when the real anti-Semitism is over there? The real problem is Trump and his conspiracy theory and Charlottesville and Trump's inability to say that the Nazis at Charlottesville were un-American. The real problem is on the right. And people on the right, if you mention Trump and his final day campaign video, they'll say, no, you've got it all wrong. Trump's fine, but the real problem is on the left. And everyone says the real problem is over there. There's no problem in my political community. The real problem is in your political community. And that problem is indicative and symbolic of what's shit about you altogether. Yeah? So everybody's against the anti-Semitism in the people they hate anyway. And there's more and more hate and more polarization. And And actually, those two movements are getting to have more and more in common with each other. So we do have what seems to be solidarity, but we don't have the kind of solidarity that I think we need.
Tyrone.
I just wanted to thank you for your talk first before I started speaking. I have a comment before my question. So I just wanted to say it's like a game of cat and mouse with Corbyn, with all the things that you were saying. Like people question him and people accuse him, but it's like he always finds a way to like maneuver around the question or avoid the question. And it's like they can never catch him, they can never like quite get him. And I just also wanted to say like clearly with when you said the world was split into two different groups, imperialists and anti-imperialists. I just want to say clearly the world is it's more complicated than that, than just a simple representation by two groups. So I just wanted to ask if you had any thoughts or ideas. What are some effective methods that the people, be it Corbyn's opposition or the Jewish community, can do to combat Corbyn as a leader and his way of thinking?
So the first question, the first bit, is really interesting. That Corbyn's response is just to be nice. You know, he says, look, I'm nice. I'm against racism. My mother was at Cable Street fighting the black shirts in 1930. I've always fought racism. I condemn anti-Semitism. You know, why are you being so mean to me? That's what he does, a kind of passive-aggressive thing. You know, I'm the victim here. And that's what he does, and he gets away with it because the people raising the issue of anti-Semitism anyway is considered kind of weird and vulgar and Jewish and tribal, and you know everybody knows that Jews are not oppressed. Why are you going on about the Jews when actually everybody else is oppressed and you're not? You're white, you're rich, you're powerful, you control the media, you control... And then before you know it, they're into an anti-Semitic narrative. So, I mean, a bit like, in his own way, Trump does the same. He kind of goes, you know, I'm nice. I mean, he's not what we might think is nice, but he does the same game. So, one of the benefits of that is nothing could be discovered about Corbyn which could bring him down, because it's already out there. Again, like Trump, what could you discover about Trump that would bring him down? Nothing. Because somehow... Because I don't know. Maybe because personality cult, you know? So, if you find that he's been in collusion with Putin, his supporters wear T-shirts that say, I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat. You know, it's kind of extraordinary. The second part of your question, look, it's really important, right? So, Marx, for example, right? I mean, I'm quite ambivalent about Marx. Marx wrote the most amazing, complex, rich, interesting scientific theory about capitalism, right? And the reason he did that, I think, one of the real key reasons he did that is to undercut conspiracy theory. He said socialism is not about a small group of powerful, bad people stealing money from everybody else and keeping them down and lying to them. That's not what it is. What it is this. What it is capitalism. Let's try and understand how it works. Let's try and create an account of how capitalism works and how capitalism produces these results of inequality, how capitalism produces a world that looks like a conspiracy of the rich, of the powerful, of the men, of the white people, but it isn't a conspiracy. So that's what Robert Fine and Philip Spencer do. They kind of stubbornly, and of course also Moïse Postone, who also died recently. Our kind of heroes are dying. Moïse Postone, you know, clung doggedly to Marxism and said that's not what they mean. You know, Corbyn has not read Marx. Corbyn does not understand capital, right? And not many people have. So actually then you get these sort of little cliques of kind of really clever Jewish Marxists, mainly Jewish Marxists, not all Jewish Marxists, who kind of say that Marx is so much more interesting than just a conspiracy theory. But of course, the way that Marx has manifested in the world, in Russia, in China, in North Korea, in Poland, in Hungary, has always been as a conspiracy theory and as a way of saying bourgeois law and rights and equality don't matter. So, yes, we can come up with Marxist understandings of the world which are really positive and empowering and useful. We just don't. Read Postone, read Fine and Spencer, to trace back that history. But I'm kind of ambivalent about how important that is, because Marxism in power has never managed to really trace that Marxist history and that Marxist thought.
So, wait, hold on. We're sort of out of time, so we're going to collect 3 questions very succinctly with you and Albert and Valerie. So just like very pointed questions, and then we'll give David a few minutes to respond.
Okay. Do you think there are more people in UK government, in common people, more people who sympathize Arabs and Palestinians than in America? Do you think there is connections with the traditional relationship between UK and Arab countries from the First World War?
You very briefly touched upon that we can see contemporary anti-Semitism disconnected from nationalism and populism nowadays, if I'm quoting you correctly.
Go on.
Chantal Mouffe is following Ernesto Laclau, is very much propagating populism as a way for the left to counter the right populism of Trump, which is stealing away the working class. How would you respond to that? And is that possibly a new danger for...
Yeah.
As I heard you speak, thank you, about institutionalized racism, is it useful or constructive to think of institutionalized anti-Semitism in the same ways, and thinking about perpetrators as victims that keeps coming up, and things that it has in common with that kind of structure, if you could?
All right. So there's a story about the kind of Arabism, the pro-Arab friendliness within the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. You know, I'm sure some of that exists. I'm sure there are those old relationships. I think today we have much more importance in the rise of the two populisms. The rise of this left populism, which turns into a kind of conspiracy theory and develops a kind of particular fetish about Israel and Zionism and the Jews. And then even this week, I mean, Boris Johnson, who was one of the guys behind Brexit, had a meeting with Steve Bannon last week, and we know what Steve Bannon says. Steve Bannon says, say racist things, get denounced as a racist, own it, it will make you more popular, right? Because that's what he said openly to the Front National in France. The first thing Boris Johnson says is Islamophobic things about women looking like letterboxes and women looking like bank robbers. And the first thing Johnson does is to put that into action. So it seems to me that, yes, that old kind of Foreign Office British pro-Arabism is alive, and it kind of, a lot of the old stuff manages to find its way to the new politics. And the old stuff wasn't that important, and it was kind of dying out, but it's suddenly got a new life. So it will get a new life partly through Islamophobia and partly through anti-Semitism. Nick Cohen had a beautiful tweet yesterday, said, Britain today, if you hate the Jews, vote Labour. If you hate the Muslims, vote Tory. And that's Britain today. Chantal Mouffe and her left populism, I think it's a really, really dangerous game, and I think it's fundamentally what I said earlier on about socialism or barbarism. I think politically what we have to do is to defend democracy. We don't say, oh yeah, you know, all these attacks on democracy are fundamentally right, and Weimar was terrible, and now it's a fight between us and the fascists. I don't think, the more I think about that, the more awful I think it was to just sort of push Weimar under the bus. We should have been defending Weimar and defending democracy and defending the idea that all people are of equal value, and anti-racism and anti-sexism and the equality, you know, gender equality, sexuality equality, freedom of speech, and a strong democratic state. Well, one of the slogans I've been kind of thinking about is the idea of making democracy sexy again. Because we in the academy have been talking about democracy like it's crap. And by the way, there's a parallel with the way that we in Britain have been talking about the European Union for the last 30 years. Like, oh, it's awful, but, you know, but we have it. So what do we teach our students? We teach our students that, you know, critical legal studies, that law is just a kind of fake news trick to defend the powerful. And democracy is just a kind of fake news trick to defend the powerful. And when we teach Foucault, what people often hear we're teaching is that knowledge is power, and power is knowledge, and there's no such thing as experts or science. Or and I could go on about how we intellectuals need to take some responsibility for that. And if you go back to Hannah Arendt and what she was writing in the 1950s, was looking again at what happened, at how Nazism and Stalinism became intellectually respectable. And what they have in common is this kind of ultra-radical critique of everything that exists. And you'll see that in the Brexit movement, in the Trump movement, in the Corbyn movement. Everything that exists is fake. Everything that exists is rubbish. Democracy is fake. Law is fake. Equality is fake. We need to tear it all down and start from the beginning. And this populism, both its left version and its intellectual version and its right version and its anti-EU version and its jihadi version, is all a contempt for what exists. And, you know, of course that makes me sound very conservative, and I'm not particularly conservative, but a critique for what exists is not the same as a contempt for what exists. If you don't like the European Union, you make it better. If it's not, you know, if there's problems with it, you make it better. You don't smash it up and hope that it all collapses and that there's crisis. And then, you know, people remember Zizek before the Trump election. Zizek, the big, clever intellectual, saying, yeah, it'd be better if Trump wins than if Hillary wins because it'll really stir things up, right? Socialism or barbarism? No. We go back and we defend democracy. Institutional racism was really important. And in Britain, institutional racism, the discussions around that were won partly by this kind of sociology and partly by the activists, were won through the Macpherson inquiry. I don't know if you know about the Macpherson inquiry. The investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence was messed up by the police. It was messed up by the police because they started with racist assumptions about how it had happened. And in fact, it was a racist murder, and they assumed it was some kind of black-on-black gang murder. And the police screwed it up. And this scandal took 10, 15 years to come to the surface. And in the end, there was a public inquiry, and the judge said for the first time, there is an issue of institutional racism in the police force. And the police federation, like the guys who speak for the policemen, they said, how dare you say that the policemen are all racist? And of course, Macpherson didn't say that policemen are all racist. He said that there's a problem of institutional racism, of ways of thinking, of norms, of practices within the police, and that the police needs to deal with it. And so now we use that as an analogy for what's happened on the left. There isn't, you know, there's a problem of political and institutional racism, of tolerance of racism, of a culture which nurtures and allows anti-Semitism on the British left today. A culture which through an emotional hostility to Israel finds its way to forgiving every kind of hostility to Israel and to Jews as being basically on the right side. And you say, this is an institutional problem, and they say, no, there are some anti-Semites, those are bad people, they happen everywhere, and if we find one, we'll get rid of them. And that's just not an answer to the question of political and institutional anti-Semitism.
Just to Valerie's point, I wrote about institutional anti-Semitism in the tradition of Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, vis-a-vis American foreign policy and engaging the Muslim Brotherhood and the Iranian revolutionary regime as a form of institutionalized anti-Semitism in the United States. I can talk to you about that. So,
can I just,
please.
One thing. I wanted to bring more books, but those are the only number of books I had, I'm afraid. If people want to buy them, they're £15, and I was kind of hoping to sell every single one of you a book because I think it would be really useful to you, but I've only got 8 here, so...
We trade books?
Can we trade books?
ISGAP books for some Hirsh books?
Nah, I've got your books already, mate. I want hard cash.
All right, so on behalf of everybody here, thank you for an amazing lecture.